It started as something small. At first, it didn't even feel worth mentioning. A missing package here, a delayed delivery there. Everyone has experienced it at some point, an online order that simply never shows up. But for one homeowner, what began as a minor inconvenience slowly unraveled into a chain of events that would expose a neighbor, and Hoa's hypocrisy, and a shocking act of entitlement. The house sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where appearances mattered almost as much as property values. The WA had rules for everything: grass length, trash bin placement, even the color of the curtains visible from the street. For most people, it was suffocating. For others, especially those who thrived on control, it was a playground. And nobody enjoyed that playground more than Karen. Karen was the type of neighbor everyone knew by name, not because she was friendly, but because she made it her mission to be involved in everyone else's business. She walked the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, reporting even the smallest violations to the WA board. She had written up complaints about cars parked an inch too close to the curb, about lawns that had grown a shade too brown, about children leaving bicycles near driveways. But beyond her obsession with the rules, Karen had another habit, one that wasn't quite so public: she had an eye for other people's packages. At first, the homeowner noticed a pattern. Packages marked as delivered mysteriously vanished within hours. Sometimes it was a box of clothes. Sometimes a household item, nothing worth thousands, but enough to raise suspicion. After the third package disappeared in 2 weeks, the thought crossed his mind: maybe it wasn't a delivery error. Maybe it was theft. The problem with package theft is that it's hard to prove. Unless someone was caught in the act, the missing boxes could always be explained away. A courier mistake, a neighbor accidentally grabbing the wrong box, porch pirates passing through the neighborhood. But in this case, the timing was suspicious, and there was one neighbor whose eyes always lingered a little too long whenever deliveries arrived. It was Karen. Karen's house sat directly across the street, giving her a perfect view of every doorstep. Every time a truck pulled up, she would glance out her window. Sometimes she would even step outside under the pretense of tending to her plants or checking the mailbox. She was always watching. The homeowner tried to shake off the suspicion, but the frustration built. Each lost package felt like an invasion. Money wasted, time wasted, and most of all, the unsettling thought that someone so close, someone who pretended to be the guardian of the neighborhood standards, might be stealing right from under his nose. It was a Saturday morning when the frustration finally boiled over. Another package had been marked as delivered the day before, but it was nowhere to be found. It wasn't just a missing order anymore. It was a pattern. It was deliberate. That's when the idea formed: if Karen was the thief, she needed to be caught. Not with accusations, not with speculation, but with undeniable proof. The homeowner invested in a set of discreet security cameras. They were small, barely noticeable, and positioned to give a clear view of the front porch and driveway. The placement was deliberate, out of sight to a casual passerby but sharp enough to capture anyone who stepped too close. Days passed without incident. Packages arrived and remained untouched. For a moment, it seemed like maybe the suspicion had been misplaced. Maybe it had all been coincidence. But then, late one afternoon, the perfect opportunity appeared. A delivery truck stopped and dropped off a medium-sized box, placing it neatly at the front door. From across the street, movement stirred. Curtains shifted. A familiar figure emerged. Karen. She walked out casually, pretending to check her mailbox. Her eyes darted toward the package. She hesitated, glanced around, and then walked back inside. For a moment, it looked like nothing would happen. But only 10 minutes later, Karen stepped out again. This time without hesitation, she crossed the street slowly, looking both ways as if she were simply out for a stroll. But instead of walking past the house, she stopped. She bent down. She picked up the package. And without even a glance toward the doorbell, she tucked it under her arm and walked away. The camera caught everything. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't just frustration. It was proof, undeniable proof that the same woman who spent her days enforcing petty WA rules had been caught committing theft. But proof alone wasn't enough. The question now was what to do with it. Should the homeowner confront Karen directly? Should the WA be informed? Or was it time to involve the police? Each option carried its own risks. Confronting her might escalate things. Reporting her to the WA might result in nothing. They were known to protect their own board members, and Karen was close with several of them. The police would take it seriously, but it might turn the entire neighborhood against him. As night fell, the homeowner sat with the footage, replaying it over and over again. The satisfaction of finally knowing the truth clashed with the uncertainty of what came next. One thing was clear, though: Karen had crossed the line. And the next steps would determine not just the outcome of this theft, but the balance of power in the entire neighborhood. The evidence was there. The question was how to use it, and that decision would lead to consequences far greater than anyone expected. The footage was undeniable. In the stillness of his living room, the homeowner replayed the video frame by frame. Karen, with her familiar gait, her casual glance around the street, and the way she tucked the box beneath her arm, it was all captured in perfect clarity. There was no ambiguity, no possible excuse. The package had been stolen, and the thief was none other than the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. For a moment, the satisfaction was overwhelming. After weeks of frustration, suspicion, and financial loss, the truth was finally revealed. Yet with that satisfaction came the heavier burden of choice. Having proof was one thing. Using it was another. The next move had to be careful, deliberate, and above all, calculated. The homeowner thought through the possibilities. Confronting Karen directly was tempting. Marching across the street, knocking on her door, and demanding accountability had a certain appeal. But Karen was unpredictable. She thrived on control and manipulation, and any direct confrontation could easily spiral into denial, deflection, or worse, a counterattack filled with accusations. She wasn't the type to back down. The police were another option. With the footage, the case would be straightforward. A stolen package, clear evidence, and a suspect identified beyond doubt. But calling the police meant escalating the situation beyond repair. The neighborhood would know. Karen would be humiliated, yes, but she would also become dangerous. And in a community governed by ennui, alliances mattered. Karen had influence with the board, and that influence could quickly turn into retaliation in the form of HOA fines and harassment. Then there was the law itself. Reporting Karen to the very institution she wielded so freely against others carried a bitter irony. But the problem was obvious: the WA board had always shown favoritism. They tolerated Karen's behavior because she enforced their rules with ruthless precision. If she was exposed, would they act? Or would they quietly dismiss the complaint and protect her? Each path had risks, but the homeowner knew he couldn't sit on the footage forever. Every day that passed without action was another day Karen believed she could act without consequence. Something had to be done. The first step was subtle. The homeowner decided to test the waters, sharing the video with a trusted neighbor. It was a calculated choice, someone who had also complained of missing deliveries. The reaction was immediate. Shock turned to anger, and then anger turned into resolve. The neighbor spread the story further, and before long, whispers began to circulate. In just a few days, Karen's pristine image of authority began to crack. Neighbors who once saw her as the neighborhood's watchdog now looked at her with suspicion. Every time she stepped outside, it seemed as though someone was watching. Conversations hushed when she walked by. People stopped waving. The subtle shift in the air was undeniable. Karen noticed. Her routines changed. She no longer strolled leisurely around the block with her clipboard. Instead, she became defensive, staying closer to home, glaring across the street at the homeowner's house. It was as though she sensed the net closing in, even if she didn't yet know exactly how much proof existed against her. But suspicion alone wasn't enough to bring her down. And Karen knew how to fight back. The retaliation came in the form of HOA letters. At first, they were small: warnings about trash bins left out too long, or grass that appeared uneven. Then came fines for supposed violations, each one more ridiculous than the last. The homeowner realized quickly what was happening. Karen was pulling strings behind the scenes, using the law to punish him for daring to expose her. What she hadn't counted on, however, was the footage spreading beyond whispers. One neighbor had quietly uploaded a clip to a local community group online, blurring identifying details but making the point clear: a neighborhood thief was among them. The video gained traction, shared from one resident to another, until nearly the entire neighborhood had seen it. The figure in the footage wasn't named, but everyone recognized Karen's walk, her hairstyle, her posture. The outrage grew. Packages had been disappearing for weeks, maybe months. And suddenly, it all made sense. Karen's control was slipping. The homeowner knew the timing was critical. If he pressed forward too quickly, Karen might rally what influence she had left, twisting the narrative into one of victimhood. But if he waited too long, the law might tighten its grip and bury him in fines. The strategy had to be precise. He began documenting everything. Every notice from the HOA was filed. Every interaction with Karen was recorded. He built a case not just of theft, but of retaliation and harassment. The cameras that had caught her stealing now captured her standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring into his property. They captured WA representatives walking up with warning notices, sometimes within hours of Karen being spotted on the street. The pattern was obvious, and with each piece of evidence, the case grew stronger. But Karen wasn't ready to give up. If anything, her behavior became bolder. She doubled down on her role as the protector of the neighborhood, trying desperately to maintain the facade of authority. She sent emails to residents, warning them about suspicious activity. She framed herself as the victim of harassment, claiming she was being unfairly targeted. Yet the footage spoke louder than her words. And as more residents quietly admitted to their own missing packages, the tide fully turned. The community no longer saw Karen as a guardian. They saw her as the problem. The homeowner knew the final step was near. He had the footage. He had the community's support. He had the paper trail of harassment. The only question left was how to end it, through the WA, through the police, or through a public exposure that would leave Karen no room to maneuver. The decision weighed heavily, but one thing was certain: the story was no longer just about a stolen package. It was about power, hypocrisy, and the lengths one person would go to control an entire neighborhood. And as Chapter 2 came to a close, the homeowner prepared for the showdown that would finally strip Karen of the power she clung to so desperately. The cameras had caught her once. But now, they were about to catch her downfall. The tension in the neighborhood had reached its breaking point. What began as whispers of suspicion had evolved into undeniable proof, and what had once been quiet resentment toward Karen had now transformed into outright hostility. She had been caught stealing, caught retaliating, and caught manipulating the WA to serve her own vendettas. The only thing left was to decide how to bring the story to its end. For the homeowner, the choice no longer felt optional. The harassment had escalated too far. Letters and fines kept arriving, each one more absurd than the last. Even neighbors who had once stayed silent now admitted they were targets as well, buried under frivolous complaints and bogus citations. Karen's grip was weakening, but like a cornered animal, she fought harder than ever to cling to power. The homeowner realized that the fight could no longer be kept in the shadows. To win, the battle had to be made public. And the best weapon was the very evidence she had given him herself, the video footage. With meticulous planning, the homeowner compiled everything into a single presentation. It began with the stolen package, the crystal clear footage of Karen walking across the street, lifting the box, and retreating with it. It then showed the timeline of retaliatory WA notices, paired with camera clips of Karen lurking near the property just hours before each one was issued. Finally, it included testimonies from neighbors, those who had lost packages, those who had endured Karen's constant meddling, and those who were finally ready to speak. It was more than proof. It was a story of hypocrisy, entitlement, and control gone too far. The venue for the final act was the monthly WA meeting. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs filled with discussions about landscaping budgets and paint color approvals. But on that night, the room was full. Word had spread that something was coming, something big. Residents crowded into the small clubhouse, eager to witness what had become the most anticipated showdown the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen was there too, seated at the front, clipboard in hand, attempting to project confidence. But her eyes betrayed her unease. She had heard the whispers, seen the stares. She knew something was different. When the time came, the homeowner stood and presented the evidence. The room fell silent as the footage played. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Karen appeared on the screen, unmistakably caught in the act of theft. Her posture, her clothing, her unmistakable figure bending to take the package, it was undeniable. There was no explanation she could offer. No way to spin the truth. The second half of the presentation landed even harder. Each WA notice was displayed alongside camera footage of Karen's behavior, painting a clear picture of retaliation and abuse of authority. Neighbors murmured in agreement, nodding as the dots connected. One by one, they began to speak up, adding their own experiences to the pile of grievances. Karen's face reddened, her composure cracking with every passing minute. She attempted to interject, but the room no longer belonged to her. The board members, once her allies, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they could not protect her without destroying their own credibility. The tide had turned completely. By the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. The law stripped Karen of her authority, removing her from any position of influence. The police were contacted, and though the package thefts were relatively minor in monetary value, the pattern and evidence were enough to open a case. For the first time, Karen faced real consequences. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Without Karen's constant surveillance and meddling, the atmosphere lightened. People waved at each other again. Children played without fear of being reported. Packages arrived and stayed on doorsteps, untouched until their rightful owners brought them inside. The sense of community, once suffocated by Karen's presence, began to rebuild. As for Karen, her downfall was swift and absolute. The same neighbors she once ruled with intimidation now avoided her entirely. Her reputation was destroyed, her influence gone, her name whispered not with respect, but with ridicule. The very thing she had craved most, control, had been ripped away, exposed by her own arrogance and entitlement. For the homeowner, it was more than a victory. It was justice. The stolen packages had been frustrating, but the deeper wound had been Karen's hypocrisy, the way she held others to impossible standards while secretly breaking the most basic rules of decency. Exposing her was more than payback. It was the restoration of balance in a neighborhood that had suffered under her reign for far too long. The cameras remained, not out of paranoia, but as a reminder. They had captured the truth once, and that truth had been powerful enough to change everything. In the end, the story of Karen's downfall spread far beyond the neighborhood. The video circulated online, gaining traction in community groups and eventually going viral. People everywhere recognized the type. Every town had a Karen, someone who thrived on control until the moment they were caught in their own hypocrisy. For the homeowner, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, the best revenge wasn't anger or confrontation. It was patience, preparation, and letting the truth speak louder than anything else. And as the last remnants of Karen's influence faded into memory, the neighborhood stood as proof. Those who build their power on fear and control will always, eventually, be exposed.